Thanks for the invite, Helena.
Okay, so it looks like we are live, and I'm just sitting around waiting for the YouTube to start so I can mute it, and it looks like I've accomplished that. So, welcome to Chapter 3. I thought I would review a little bit and try to be as fast as I can for Chapter 1 and 2 so we can sort of know where we are. So Chapter 1, he sort of begins describing sense data in this sort of dualistic view. He makes this distinction between appearances and reality. Let's see, appearances or phenomenon or sense data and reality or noumena or things in themselves. And he concludes that, let's see, we can only really know about the external world by inferring from the sense data, because how we learn about experience-based things about the external world is always mediated by our experience of it, right? And so he calls this these appearances sense data. Okay, so once we accept that, then we have to say that we can't really prove the things in themselves. We can't really prove the external world really exists. All we really can do is suppose that it really exists, and we back up those suppositions with arguments, and then he gives his arguments in Chapter 2. So we're sort of faced with this, I guess, hole in our knowledge, or epistemic hold. And he says in Chapter 2, philosophy, he just admits philosophy can't really establish the existence of an external world. We're stuck with these instinctive beliefs. He talks about the instinctive beliefs in Chapter 2 and says philosophy can help us examine our instinctive beliefs and sort of disentangle what is really a strong rock bottom instinctive belief from what we might have mistaken for one. And sort of clean things up a little bit, and that philosophy can help us organize and systematize all our instinctive beliefs into a hierarchy, and that we use the idea of, I guess he's sort of kind of using coherence at the very end of Chapter 2, saying that we use this idea of beliefs contradicting one another to sort of choose among even these instinctive beliefs, which ones we ought to throw out and which ones we ought to keep. And that's sort of something that you can use argument to do. So by the end of Chapter 2, he concludes that we have this one shared instinctive belief that there really is this external world, and then he gives some reasons for keeping that belief, and he claims that there are no good reasons for throwing it out. I think that's a tease for what he's going to do in Chapter 4. So he said like a couple of times, there's just no good reason for believing that there isn't an external world, but he's never said why he thinks that. I think that that's a setup. Shadow, you probably know if it's a setup or not because you've read the whole book.
It is, so he is setting stuff up as specifically for his chapter on idealism, but I won't plot spoil.
Okay. Okay, so now we're at Chapter 3. So let's see. So we've kind of established, at least to some degree, I guess, that it's okay to suppose the external world does exist. And then at the beginning of Chapter 3, which he titles The Nature of Matter, which was astounding to me, he says that he's going to investigate the nature of the external world. So let me see. He says in the first paragraph, the question we have to consider in this chapter is, what's the nature of this real table, which persists independently of my perception of it? So you're kind of expecting he's going to talk about the nature of things, but he's not really doing that. He's doing something different. So he does give sort of this scientific explanation. He says that science has an answer so far as it goes as to the nature of the table. And then he says, I think it's even in the second paragraph. Yeah, page 15. Physical science has drifted, physical science has drifted into the view that all natural phenomena ought to be reduced to wave motions. Okay, and he starts with light, and says light is a way. Oh, just one second. I've got to. Can't do two things at once any longer. Somebody here's saying, "Why didn't you invite me?" So let me just give them, paste their invite there. There we go, and I can get back to it. He talks about light and space and time. So
shape.
he does have this. Oh yeah, and shape. Well, he starts with. He says, to me, he's sort of using shape to segue into space.
Yep.
He sort of draws this analogy. Okay, so I don't know. I'm kind of tempted, because I know that Simon knows a lot about, well, a lot more than I do about modern physics. I'm kind of tempted to talk about sort of the way in 1912 Russell was viewing science, but I don't know if that's going to detract too much or not.
Well, I would certainly. I was amazed going through this chapter at how much of an understanding he obviously had of physics and the two types of physics, quantum mechanics and also relativity. And in 1912, that's amazing. Right. That's absolutely
right. During the hot sort of, it was during the hot time for that.
What year did Einstein publish his papers on relativity?
1905 and 1919, I think, was general.
So I mean, he's up to date. For him, this is contemporary physics, right?
Yeah, exactly. And also the quantum side. Everything is reducible to waves as a physical understanding. I mean, that's quantum field theory. And I didn't even get that in my, that didn't even get into textbooks till the 70s probably. So wow. For school it was obviously at higher levels. It's there. But yeah, I mean, I was quite amazed about the two ways he had. But again, the first part of it being this reducible to momentum, which is obviously, goes back in physics further.
It's a Newtonian idea, right?
That's the Newtonian idea. And then the idea of everything being waves is a quantum mechanical idea. And then the idea about time, and more importantly, the sequence of time being a kind of a relationship, a correlation between our sense data and the physical world. Again, for him to understand that's quite deep in the mathematics. So I was completely shocked by this chapter.
Yeah, I was too. When I first read it.
Yeah. So sorry to digress from where you were going, but I did want to say that straight away because I did find it quite amazing.
No, that's fine. I couldn't really talk because my dogs were creating wave motions. But I think they're quiet now. So this business about when I was reading it, like I try to read this as though I've never heard of anything even remotely like this, so that I can give a sort of entertaining reading and sort of be outraged in things while I read. And he says something like the medium is some kind of aether, and that was surprising to me. Anyway, I didn't think that was. What does he mean by that? There has to be a medium for light to travel in?
Probably not. I think it's space he was referring to there. So, one of the things I said is all the world's a stage, as in, the physical objects themselves have a stage upon which they play, and that stage is the space. So that's what I took that to mean.
Okay, so that's more when he was... So you can see that as him just saying space. That light is in a space. So the other thing he says when he starts talking about space is that science, I think he says, has to have one big ultimate objective space in which things happen. And you think that when he's talking about the aether, he's kind of just referring to that?
I would be pretty certain. I'm not sure when those aether experiments were done, but I think it was in the 1800s. So Russell would have known that there's no such thing as an aether in terms of the way it was postulated in science before before those experiments were done.
Okay.
I can't remember them. Michelson, Morley, maybe? Don't know. That's a pure guess.
Somebody else is saying they want an invite, so I've got to take a second here. I have to pull up my PMs. Fill the time while I do that.
Well, I mean, I thought when Russell mentions aether, he's sort of just mentioning it as a possible explanation for the wave motion, right? Like he's saying science sort of agrees that it's a wave motion. We just don't agree the substrate that wave motion happens on. But I think he says even either way, that's what philosophers call matter, and so that's what we can agree on. But I think so I don't think he's necessarily proposing ether as a possible explanation, unless it's just considered from in general. Some people think it's a possible explanation.
I think that's right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So let's maybe, Shadow, maybe you can talk about how he segues to space from talking about the shape of the coin.
Well, so what he wants to emphasize is the intrinsic nature of the things that are independent of our sense data. So he's saying that our sense data are appearances of things that are really in reality. And so what can we know about this stuff external to our sense data? And so he's starting with abstract concepts. So space, time, shape, these are things that elude our five senses. So if I were to say, that this door, has the property of being square, that's not something that I can go out and do some sort of test, or if I were to say that time flows, that there's this, flow of time, that might be unreliable, that might not be, the way the nature of time really is. It could be misleading. And I think this was right around the time of J.M. McTaggart. And so there was A theory, B theory of time, and A theory of time being, that there's this, the past is no longer real, the present is real, and the future is yet to be real. And then the B theory of time, where the past, present, and future are all equally real, and there's just before now and after now, and time's passage is an illusion. And so these raise a bunch of difficult problems that Russell's going to get into a little bit more in the next chapter, but he's setting the stage. He's showing you how difficult it is. Just our a priori concepts of time and space and shape are on the same sort of groundings as the last section. We don't have any really demonstrable ways of grounding these beliefs and ways of thinking about the world, but we have stuff that's good enough that we can say, look, this belief is at least rational, and for the sake of argument, we'll grant it and move on. That's how I've understood.
Okay, so B, you said you wanted to add something real quick?
Well, I was just want to make sure, I just wanted to know if you just wanted people to kind of chime in, or so I didn't want to just interrupt if there was a certain order that you were doing things in. But it seems like you guys already passed the part that, I guess for me, the first couple paragraphs, or I guess I was reading it, so paragraphs, but the differentiation that he's making between when he's describing it, a blind man, how they can understand something but not know it, like the differentiation between those two being kind of, that is similar to the way that we can understand the relation of objects but not know the true nature, if that makes sense. I feel like you can comparison between those two. So
I agree with that. Let's spend some time talking about that. So I think he's kind of bashing reductionism. That's the feeling. I mean, that's the impression I'm getting.
I would say he's bashing reductionism. I think he's highlighting the hard problem of consciousness. He's saying that, look, it was a significant fact that everyone knows what the concept of water is, just like a blind man can understand the concept of a wavelength, but it's a further discovery that water is H2O or that light is waves. And so you can understand this significant discovery of, you know, water being H2O or of light being waves, but that explanation's not going to help you understand what that original concept was, the concept of light that the blind man doesn't have.
Right. So I saw that as sort of saying that, and I do see it as relating to this problem of consciousness. It's sort of saying that, look, science has reduced light down to what it is, quote unquote, which is this wave motion, which is a wave motion, let's call it. But what they're really doing is just telling us what is causing what we know of as light.
What's causing our sense data.
Yeah, and that doesn't really explain the thing we really are after.
No, it doesn't. He explicitly says it doesn't, and that this idea of causation in our sense perception presupposes our concepts of space and time. If we're going to have something causing our sense experiences, there's got to be some place for it to happen at some time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, but I thought, I mean, sorry, forgive me if I'm wrong, but like I thought within the context of space and time, especially, he brought up this concept of that there's a public and a private space, right? And it seemed to me like that was really significant, right? That he was building, like, we're not necessarily saying there's a space out there, but that we're building the perception of that space in our head when we corroborate it, when we check other sources, when we look to other senses to corroborate the ones that we're seeing, right? Like that we create this idea of a public space. And I thought that was sort of how he was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was sort of how he was seeing everything, you know, that he saw color and that he saw, you know, smell and all these things as being sort of dependent on that perception of us creating that public space in our head.
Mm-hmm. To go back to the water being H2O and light being waves, he's saying, look, the light and the experience of tasting water or whatnot is the private part. But the scientific part in the external world of being H2O or being some set of waves, that's the public part. We all have access to it. But even once all of us agree on this public part of it, that doesn't help us explain the private part.
Well, and he kind of towards the end, hopefully I'm not jumping, says even though we can all agree.
Oh, did she cut out?
Yes, she did. I hoped it was
me.
me.
Oh, it was getting so good too. She was right at the.
Oh, she's back. Could you just start again from the beginning of the quote?
So even though we can't all agree that there's this public space,
we can all agree on. I think because I don't know if my bandwidth is the problem. So let me know if I cut out again. But that we can all agree on
the bandwidth all the way down or off.
Yeah, you can cut your camera off too to save.
I'll turn my camera off because my kids are in Minecraft is probably the problem. So if we can all agree on the public space, the physical, and he also kind of calls it physical space times. If we can agree on seeing, like we're perceiving something as blue, and we all kind of agree on that because we can, you know, find all the common points, and it kind of seems like the average of all of it is that it's blue, and me, that object color. He's just saying that because he's saying even then we can all be perceiving something that's not even really there just because it's going through this filter, this medium between when we perceive it is kind of what I was picking up at the end.
Mm-hmm. So we've got this. So just to recap, from what I've gathered from what everyone's saying and from reading, you still have this internal, private, what it's like, phenomenal thing that explaining scientifically what is causing the phenomenon, or even some, you know, the particular features about the so-called real thing, doesn't help us get at explaining this this experience. So just like he was saying, you can't explain what light is like to a blind person. And that reminded me of the sort of what's like to be a bat, right? Even if we really do somehow get to the point where we can arguably say that we are perfectly and completely explaining sort of all the intricacies and mechanisms and means by which bats come to know what it's like to be a bat, we will still never know what it's like to be a bat.
Right.
So that's what he was talking about.
Well, I think the example he mentioned in the book was about time, right? Is that we can be aware of the passage of time, and then we can utilize the entire concept of time, but that doesn't mean that we completely understand what time is or all its facets. So he's trying to make this delineation of being able to pick enough of the content of what you're talking about to actually be able to interact with other people on the subject without needing to go down the rabbit hole of absolutely needing to know what time is. And anyone who tries to say that you need to know what time absolutely is before you can have the conversation doesn't seem rational.
Yeah. Well, he does say towards the beginning of the chapter, he says he's saying the only properties which science assigns to it. And then it says science does not deny that it may have other properties, but if so, other properties are not useful to the man of science and in no way assist him in explaining the phenomena. So that's kind of what you were saying, is he said there may be other things that we're missing that are like intrinsic to this, the reality, but we don't really necessarily need them in order to talk about it. So, yeah.
So, Brenda, do you want to add anything right now?
I haven't actually read it, so
okay.
I like
That's okay.
being here with people, but I haven't read it, so I don't know what I can contribute.
Okay, well, just pop in when things come up.
Well,
and then let's see. I want to find out. Simon, do you want to say some more?
Well, I was just going to bring up the just move it on. What I considered the next step that he was making, which was this point about the sequence of time and the distance of space being a common factor between all observers. So although we may disagree on exactly how far things are, or we will all agree on the fact that the nearest thing is nearer to us than the furthest thing, and we will agree on the order of events that happen when we bear in mind, the travel times of the information, etc.
Right. So I guess the question I have is that good enough?
I missed that. Sorry.
I'm just wondering if echoing. See if I can figure out why.
Yeah, that's Simon, I think. That was echoing. Anyway. Okay.
Right. So let's see. So he segues from the coin to space, and says also that time is the same. So he's doing. I like how Shadow said these are more abstract concepts. So I suppose it is kind of surprising to start considering actual physical objects. You don't realize that this also applies to space and time and light. So then he says again, let's see, he then says we can only really know how the external world affects us or something like that. And then asks again, can we really know anything at all about the really existing stuff that relates to the experience?
Right.
And then he says, well, we're going to assume. And then his reasons for assuming, so I think I found it. So if, as science and common sense assume, there is one public all-embracing physical space in which physical objects are, the relative positions of physical objects in physical space must more or less correspond to the relative positions of our sense data in our private spaces. There's no difficulty in supposing this to be the case. Then his reasons for, I think, why he says there's no difficulty is an appeal to your other senses and an appeal to other people, which is, I think, how we learn about that.
Mm-hmm.
But didn't he say previously that those are kind of, for example, other people are sense data. So why is he saying these 2 or 3 relations are okay to go ahead and suppose. Right?
Well, because we conceded them in the last chapter. So in the last chapter, we doubted the sense data of other people and by extension their minds. But when we move from chapter 2 to 3, we say, okay, look, there is this world independent of our senses. There are these people. And again, he's setting up for the next chapter of idealism, because the question is going to be, are these things external to us something mental or something non-mental?
Okay.
And so we don't exactly know the nature. We don't exactly know the nature of this external world. And so, again, in the tradition of Descartes, we've had this radical doubt, and we've doubted everything. And we're building everything from the ground up. And so in order to ask these questions about idealism, he's got to introduce new concepts like space and time.
Okay. So, but still, he says that we can know sort of anything that secures the correspondence between our sense data and the object. But then it also, like Simon says, I think he also says that we also can know the arrangement of the physical objects, right? How they relate to one another. And I don't know why it looks to me, at least for now, like he's just sort of privileging this one thing that he says we can know because they correspond to our sense data. And I'm not sure why he's doing that. That seems like a big leap to me.
Well, doesn't it seem like that he's, I mean, he kind of caveats all that. He says, if it is safe to assume that, I mean, he kind of says it a couple times that, and I don't know if he's just coming from a place of like, what else can you do than assume that this is somehow corresponding to something real, because otherwise I don't really know where we can go with any of our sensations or perceptions if we don't assume that some of it has to correspond to reality, I guess. Maybe that's where he's going. Go ahead, Simon.
So I guess what I want to ask is he talking about 2 types of relations? First, the relation between the sense data and the actual objects as they relate to one another, and second, the actual objects as they relate to one another with respect to their order in space and their order in time? Or is he saying that those are the same thing? To me, it looks like he's saying 2 things that you know, what we are safe to say we know are these correspondences with our sense data. And
guys, unfortunately, I'm going to have to let y'all go. I just had family arrive in town.
Okay, thank you, Shadow, for coming in.
Yes, thank you for having me. Let me know when chapter 4 is going to be read. I'd certainly
It'll be
like
next
to be there
week.
for
It's going to be a fun one because I can tell he's setting us up.
Yeah.
So these pieces that feel missing, I know that he's going to fill them in, right? So
in the idealism chapter is a very big chapter. He covers a lot of ground.
Oh, geez.
This one was like 3 pages or something.
Okay.
But the next one's a bit more substantive.
Well, we're definitely going to need you for that. That's for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, everyone
Nice
have a
to meet
wonderful
you.
evening.
Thank you. It feels like maybe I just answered my own question when I wasn't able to finish the sentence. He's saying
Well,
that the correspondences that we can safely say we know about are.
So there should be a reason why those correspondences hold, though. And I think the reason is that, I mean, I can't explain it in the way Russell or philosophically it could be explained, but the way I understood it to be, and this is certainly just upon my reading, that under transformation, the sequence of events is always going to be the same. It's something that can't change, and especially between multiple or independent witnesses, right? So if the events always happen the same from whichever angle you look at it, then that would certainly imply there's only one there's only one cause for all of those.
Right. Well, then that seemed to me like how the scientific, I mean, that's kind of describing the scientific method and why we see that as a way of, the best way of approaching figuring things out is that we, repeatability and the fact that we keep perceiving things and it seems to average out to this. That's kind of how we
it's a little more precise than that, I think.
Well, yeah, I think, I mean, it's weird because I feel like in this chapter, Russell's sort of building an analogy, right? Like, so when he talks about like blind people can know certain aspects of the world but not see it like directly, I think he's sort of using that as an analogy, right? But he also builds it into his idea of space, right? That like we can see the spatial relations, but we don't necessarily experience the distance between them, or the way that they're related. But we can definitely see the relation between them, right? And I think that's what he's talking about when he's talking about all of this sense data. He's saying like we're not perceiving directly the thing itself or the property of the matter. We're perceiving the relation it has with whatever's around it.
Right. Yeah.
And in that sense, I think he's sort of saying that like we're not actually perceiving the nature of matter, but in a roundabout way. Maybe he's saying that we don't need to.
Right.
But like there's also I feel he's really building that analogy towards what does he say, like that that we. How does he put it here? We agreed provisionally that physical objects cannot be quite like our sense data, but may be regarded as causing our sensations. And like the physical objects are in a space of science, which we call physical space. And so he's not just necessarily building it to we see it directly, we're perceiving it directly, but he's saying that we arrange it like we arrange space, just in terms of its relation with each other.
That was somewhat of my understanding as well, that he was trying to make a very clear delineation between the idea of the content of a thought, or like the content of our concept, and the concept itself in actuality. And he didn't seem to think that there would be that big of a deal taking different people's opinions of what that content was and doing like a comparative analysis between them so that we could as a group render down useful information, which is again kind of what the scientific process is.
Right.
It's this overall averaging of information. So yes, you will never get to the 100% delineation that you now can claim you know absolutely what this thing is you're talking about, but it is like refining gold. You will get to the 99% pure, and that should hopefully be good enough.
Yeah, like I thought. Yeah, I mean, I thought what he was endeavoring for in this chapter was a correspondence with your sense data, right? Like he almost said that like you could pretty much put anything into it as long as it preserves that correspondence with your sense data.
Well,
what does he say?
Kind of must under Einstein.
I think he's saying that the correspondence
please go ahead.
sense data of the relations in space and time are like you get the green light to go ahead and suppose those. But not all sense data can be like that.
Yeah.
What would you mean, like when he's saying, thus we may assume that there's a physical space in which physical objects have spatial relations corresponding to those that correspond with our sense data? Is that what you're talking about, Helena? That where he's kind of saying that? Okay.
It sounds to me like he's saying that these spatial relations are sort of a special in that we can go ahead and assume them.
Right.
Whereas he wouldn't say that about color or something like that.
Right. Well, he does, and then he says, then he goes on after that to say, assuming that it does correspond, what can we know about it? We can know only what is required in order to secure the correspondence. So, I mean, I guess, I don't know. He doesn't exactly say why he thinks that's safe to assume, but I guess he's just kind of going with it.
Right. What he does say about why it's safe to assume is just, the other people thing, and that the other senses also will affirm the vision, for example.
And the distance and the sequence, right? Those are the two key.
Yeah.
The relationship, if you like. But that must,
right.
if there's only.
Am I misreading that?
Yeah, because I think. Oh, go ahead, please.
Well, I was going to say, if there's only one, if we're assuming there is one cause for this, for all observers, and if that is the case, then the sequence must be preserved between all the observers. If there's only one cause, if not, there could be more than one cause, and we find that it is in fact preserved. Right? So
yeah, in that same paragraph, he kind of goes on to more clarify it, where he's saying we can know more than about the distances themselves. So he's saying that we really can't. Yeah, and he says we can know the properties of the relations required to preserve the correspondence with the sense data, but we cannot know the nature of the terms between. So he's all he's saying is that if it holds up that these things correspond, then we can know kind of relatively where they are, but not really anything other than that, I think is kind of what he's saying.
We can know
how that maps to the actual reality. That's what I don't know if he's saying that or not.
I think he's saying we can know the order that exists within, but not the individual values.
Yeah.
How do I perceive sense data?
No.
That was kind of, wasn't it? Last.
Don't I need sense?
Don't I over in the last chapter?
Yeah, don't I need sense data to perceive my sense data?
Yes, but Brenda, we agreed, at least provisionally.
Yeah.
As he says in chapter 3. Right. So this is to me, the most interesting question so far, is this acceptance of sense data. Now, to go through Russell, we have to just accept this view and see where he's going. But I really want one day to get back to direct realism, because look at all these problems. I mean, it doesn't seem, at least so far, like adopting this view, is going to be any better than adopting direct realism. I mean, with direct realism, you just kind of have one problem. So far, this is getting awfully complicated and maybe not even necessary.
Sorry, Helena. Hi.
Yeah.
What view is Bertrand putting out here in this chapter?
So I think it's a kind of dualism. It seems like a kind of dualism. Now, we've got some people who know more about philosophy right here with us, and they can really probably explain it even better. But to me, it looks like a kind of dualism. He says that these internal experiences that we have, we're going to call the result of them sense data. So we have these phenomenal experiences, and we can only know the external world based on them. So we can't really know the external world. We have to suppose a bunch of stuff. Okay, go ahead.
You don't have to suppose a bunch of stuff. And I'm sorry if my sound's a little weird. I don't have my headset in right now. So if you approach this from like a position of coherence, take on that is that you have to be able to bridge this gap between the mental states and especially like the physical reality around you. One sec. If you because you can't presuppose certain things, like Brenda was saying there, like the reliability of your sense data. Okay, so you couldn't if you want to know that that your sense data was reliable, you couldn't justify it using the reliability of your sense data. So under like and this is what kind of
hang on. You mean senses, because under his definition of sense data, it's impossible to get them wrong. So you're talking about the reliability of your senses?
Well, yeah, sure, the reliability of your senses, but I disagree that it's impossible to get the sense data wrong. There's a lot of things that that are from our sense data. Like take a look at a magic trick or an illusionist. We might be seeing or interpreting in such a way, but we wouldn't accept it as what our senses is taking in as fact, because we know that there's certain reasons why we won't. But I can get back to that. But the point is that when you have these experiences, okay, so that you have, and this is a way that Bonjour put it, is that you have these experiences, these beliefs that are formed in a cognitive, spontaneous way. That these beliefs are just formed. Is you have no control over them, and these are going to be based on inputs from what you perceive as an external world, and because of this, you form these beliefs about these events that are happening, and you view those beliefs as this causal relationship, as Simon put it. It's a causal relationship. So you have there's something out there that is causing these events to happen, and you don't have to necessarily rely on your senses or have to even assume them. Those can be built into like a coherent model, where so you're not going to try to justify your senses through your senses, but you take on these spontaneously generated beliefs that's forming in your head, and you see how they cohere with the rest of the beliefs that you have. So it's like this. How do you put it? In order for us to have access to the external reality like this, is that you have a certain like role of an observer in taking in this data, and you don't have to just assume that everything that you get and try to justify it through what you have through your senses, trying to justify it through your senses. You get the stuff in, and it just simply coheres with the beliefs that you have.
Okay, so I think when you're saying, you get the stuff in through your senses, he is saying that he wants to give a name to the experience of seeing something, for example. And he wants to say that those appearances are kind of things, and they're things.
Yes.
They're things
Yes.
that are in your mind. So because it's you experiencing, in that way, it's impossible to be mistaken or wrong or something like that. So sense data are these things, I think, usually in the mind. They're like objects, and that's what you're seeing. That's what he's.
Yeah.
That's what I think he's saying.
That's exactly it. Like, all you have access to is the beliefs that form from what you perceive, what you think that you're perceiving. Okay, you have access to that. That's it. But if you map it out as like that, the only reason why these beliefs form, why these spontaneous beliefs about what's happening outside you form, is because it has some type of causal relationship to something, whether it's the matrix pumping into your head, or the fact that there actually is an external world. It doesn't matter. Like, you're never going to get to the problem with where how do you justify that these senses are working? Now, I guess what would happen is that when you're having these when you have these senses coming in, if you only try to justify them by using the senses that yourself, you're obviously not going to be able to justify it because it's just going to be through circular reasoning. But there are certain ways that you can accept it where you don't have to rely on your senses. Is what I'm saying, is that you're not justifying your senses using your senses. You're justifying your senses using like a pragmatic view or a coherent view or something like that. You don't actually have to have that position where you first presuppose your senses. The first thing you have to realize is that there's a causal relationship of some events that's happening in a perceived reality and that you're taking in your head.
Okay, so you're saying that what you have to realize is that in the supposed external world, things that are happening in that supposed external world are causing the sense data. And I think that he would say, yes, that's right. That the things that happen in the external world, which we can't know really about, except we can know for some reason that the sequence and the relations in space are a good correspondence with our sense data. But other than those two, we really have a lot more doubt about the correspondence between the sense data and the real external world. Now, what you just said was that you don't have to use the reliability of your senses to try to justify the sense data coming in. Is that correct? Is that a good enough reframe of what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, you don't have to start off with like that viewpoint. Yeah.
Right. I don't think that he would say you have to, although I don't know. Jack, are you still here? Okay. John, can you help us Can you make sense out of sort of what we're talking about? I know that.
Well, I mean, like the direct course, yeah. I mean, the direct correspondence is really the issue, right? And I don't know. I mean, I think it's like maybe it's just too much to put like an ideology on Russell when he's writing these chapters, right? Because the book is meant to be like a kind of a step-by-step go through of all the problems of philosophy, like the title implies, right?
Yeah,
I mean, what he's trying to do is build it logically.
I thought it was going to be a step-by-step, but it's sort of slanted towards. I guess you have to start somewhere.
I agree. I agree that I would say that his analysis definitely has an ideological bent. So you can definitely see the way he's like bringing up certain objects or certain thoughts as a way and saying that they're more likely or that they're better argumented, right? But I think he's like, there's also parts in it where he seems to really highlight the problems with what he's saying and the problems with the way that he's putting it forward. So I think sometimes we want to leap ahead and say that like he's trying to defend us or like bring us to a conclusion, which I think he is, but I think he's trying to be as balanced as he can be.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think it's important to look at it like that. Now, my read alouds aren't like that because I'm trying to, just a little side comment on the read alouds. I'm trying to be entertaining and animated and also as outraged as I imagine someone who's never heard of this would be. So, because there are a billion read alouds that you can read that are straight read alouds. But I think go ahead.
No, go ahead, please. Look, I really do like your read alouds because I think you do add like certain emphasis where Russell probably would have put emphasis. Like I know that even in the way that he wrote, there are certain parts where it does seem like he's like pausing for effect or bringing up something in a certain order, or like he what is that, like when you italicize words, certain words to I don't know, highlight their use, right? So like I thought that it was a useful read through, but I think it's like when he's talking about like the correspondence and how we can really even be certain of it, right? Like I think he says that like, you know, we can't really know the objects in their intrinsic nature, but that we can know the relations between the physical objects, and that has correspondence to our sense data.
Yes, I think I agree that that's what he's saying, that the relations between the objects has correspondence to our sense data, and we can know that. Yeah. But his support for why he says we can know that, as opposed to that the colors have a correspondence to our sense data or something like that, I don't get his support for that so far is just other people and other senses.
Yeah, other people, yeah. So again,
well, the other people. Go
ahead.
Yeah, the other people thing comes from this idea that like, okay, so maybe in his view that if you're starting off that at least that there's other minds that are out there, if there is one unique world, okay, that's out there that's providing all this sense data, then you're going to find that views about that world will be relatively close, you know, in how we perceive it. So I mean that I guess. You know, but in order to make an argument like that, you would have to assume that there's other minds to begin with.
But this was the nugget, I thought, in chapter 3. This was the nugget for me. It's not that it's close; it's that it's exact in that the relations between the objects or the events that we're witnessing must correspond in the same order or the same distance than they do to other people, other viewers. So if somebody looking at a coin, for instance, it appears as an oval, but a specific type of oval, and we can map and transform the view of that from another position, and then we can have another mind report that view, and it does exactly correspond to what we would expect to see under one transformation. Again, I use the word transformation, so it's a mathematical term, and I guess it's the idea. But this was the nugget in it for me, is that there are things which can't be broken between different viewpoints in a physical world, but there is only one physical world. And
well, I thought it was. Oh, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Problem with that is that if you're okay with starting off by assuming other minds exist that you can verify what you're observing, then you might as well just believe that you're observing things are correctly, because you just have about as much support for that as the notion that another mind can verify it for you.
Absolutely, and it's
You,
an
you
assumption.
don't need to do that.
It's still an assumption, he says in the beginning of this chapter as well. That we
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean,
you don't need to assume that it's an other mind. You can just assume that this entity that you're perceiving has the same shared experience as you. You don't have to take it any further.
and like I mean, I thought it's interesting that that he ends with color, right? Like that his last example is the perception of color, because that really is relative to the background on which we see the color, and I mean the exact same shade will appear different if you put it on a different background, and that's why I felt like that was like the most apt perception, right? Like that we could talk about the relation, and we can talk about the relation of others in that environment, right? Like that we suppose that that's happening within a single space with us, with that object, right? Like there's all these assumptions about that we're building, but that like he's building it so slowly and building it out of like reasonable steps, right? Where he starts with light, and then space, and then time, and then moves into finally like the really obvious example of color, where it really is relative to what is around it.
Right. So I'm getting from Simon and John, I'm starting to sort of understand and maybe even become a little bit convinced that if we accept this view, that maybe there is something special about the order in time and the arrangements in space. So Simon, I was hoping that you could explain a little bit about translation. I know you said it was a math term, but it seems like pretty good support, at least from the outside. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, even though Russell doesn't mention it?
I think he does indirectly, but I guess it comes from Einstein, and John can correct me. So, yeah, I mean, under, I don't know how to best explain it, actually. So under transformations, there are certain characteristics or properties that are preserved, and they're always preserved under certain conditions. And one of the conditions we assume is symmetry. So, John, could you explain it? Because I'm just going to get confused if I try to.
I'm not really sure what exactly you mean by that. Like,
okay, well, so for instance, with time, the order of events are relative, okay, but they are the sequence of the order of events that people witness in whatever time frame or whatever relative time frame they're in is always the same.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were talking about. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, he's talking about how like we're not perceiving the time in between those steps, right? But simply that they're temporally ordered.
Indeed. So the distance, the time distance themselves may not be known, but the sequence in which they evolve will always be the same from any viewpoint. And the same with distance. Okay, so if somebody is, standing a mile behind me, okay, and I'm looking a mile into the distance, and I see two objects, and I roughly think there's 100 meters between them, the two of them. Well, the person a mile behind me may think that there's only 50 meters between them, but they will agree at which order, which one is nearer and which one is further.
Yeah, what the analogy uses is the regiment of men marching along the road. That the shape of the regiment will look different from the different point of view. What is it? That the men will appear arranged in the same order from all points of view.
Yeah.
And hence the order is true in physical space, but the shape only corresponding to where we're seeing it from, which is required for the preservation of order. Yeah.
So again, in terms of transformations, well, the perspective transformation preserves the order in which the objects appear, and in that example, the symmetry is angular. So at any angle you view it, there's going to be a transformation which still preserves the first the nearest soldier being nearest to you and the furthest soldier being furthest from you. So and that won't change under any.
Let me ask this: what is being transformed, and into what is it being transformed?
Okay, well, in that case of the soldiers, it's the shape which is being transformed. So the soldiers form a triangle, a rectangle, and that rectangle, as it moves around, okay, it changes shape to the viewer. The perspective changes, in other words. However, the numbers, if you were to number each soldier 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way along, that order of sequence of numbers would always remain the same, although you would be looking at it from different viewpoints.
I see. And so when you transform,
you're basically shifting
time or distance or something like that. You're saying, well, you can transform it to a different person's perspective, or a different any perspective,
angular perspective.
Nonetheless, the particular order will stay the same. Yeah,
and there's a mathematical transformation. There's an equation which you could write down, which would tell you, how it moves, how you would move round. But under all of those transformations, then the order would still stay the same. And the same with the sequence of time in relativity. So it doesn't matter how fast you're going, the order of the sequence of events. That may not be true, actually, in some extreme cases. But in general, the order of events will remain sequenced. So we may disagree at how long was between each event.
Right.
Right. But if one event causes another, then we will always agree then on the sequence of the events.
So Saka, does this explanation convince you a little bit more that there seem to be these at least two relations that that are just unchanged, and so we can rely on the correspondence between our sense data and those relations a little bit more? We can have more confidence on those two, in these two seeming special cases, than in other cases like color and the apparent shape of an actual object, or knowing about the objects in themselves, or distance in itself, or time in itself.
Yeah, there's two way. Yeah, like you can do this, and you can do that too without having to. I guess what I was trying to say earlier. Yeah, you can do this without having to, how you put it, rely on your senses in the sense of like a presupposition. You can do this by relying on your by having it more like a general law. That within the beliefs that you form, that there's a law in there that requires the role of the observer to have these inputs in there, and then depending on whatever epistemic framework you have, there's different ways that you can justify what you're seeing as knowledge without actually having to directly say my senses are reliable, therefore, or I assume my senses are reliable because my senses are reliable.
Right. So Carrie, do you want to talk a little bit about what you wrote in the side chat here, which is that it seems to you to be giving more, what'd you say, it highlights the importance of inter-rater reliability or something like that?
Yeah, it seemed to be the crux of his explanation was eventually that if you could establish that the multiple sense data from multiple people, just a second. Sorry, I had to cough. If you could combine the different sense data from these different entities and combine them and examine them and use them to refine down your basic knowledge, that seems to be one of the most important ways to actually test something reliably, because you may never know if your sense data is reliable. But if you base it, if you're not concerned with the absolute values, if you're only really concerned with this average that occurs between minds, then it becomes even more reliable to make sure that you bring more minds into, or more opinions at least, into the equation at all times. So it's no longer a matter about someone being able to identify that something is like justified true belief in the old sense. It's even more important that you use something like reliable truth belief, which is based on multiple people giving multiple inputs at the same time. Everything becomes a matter of the more people working together, the better.
But see, that's a problem that I disagree with, and I don't even think that Russell is going that way as well, because it's not a matter of like whether or not you can just like the idea that you could only know that your sense data was reliable is to rely on other people, first off assumes that he's trying to use his own sense data to justify his sense data. Oh, sorry, the kids there. And then on top of that, like if he's already making that assumption, then he also has the assumption that there's other minds out there, and I don't think that either one of those things are going to lead to any type of sorry guys, 1 second.
It's okay. I kind of got the idea that you were talking about, but again, in the chapter, it seemed like he was trying to go a great distance between saying that you are talking absolutely about what something is, and you're simply talking about your perception of it, and then taking your perception and comparing it to other perceptions gives you more confidence, not in any way that it is an absolute thing at all. I don't think he's trying to make an absolute statement, just that this seems to be a way that you can eventually get to something that's reliable.
Yeah, and it also seems to me that if it's the case that there is only one physical reality that multiple sense data is taking in, then it seems to me that these transformations would hold always. And so that seems to be a justification after the event maybe, but nonetheless, that's why I think the appeal to other minds is a bit stronger than just saying, well, if we all agree, it's a consensus. It seems to me that it's a necessary condition that we all agree.
And I think that with that is that I guess what I disagreed with was the idea that you could be that what he's trying to say is that you can be wrong about your senses, so therefore you should just rely on other people. I don't think that I disagree. I disagree with Terry's kind of like the representation of what he was saying there. What I was saying was that there are ways that we can have beliefs about the physical world, the external world, whatever, from our mind. There are ways that we can have beliefs about those and have them justified, and do this without having to rely on our senses as well. There are different models that we can do this for. And then if you also want to take that information that you have and then also relay this through like other minds that are out there, that again I believe that you can justify the existence of other minds, not to level of certainty, but you can at least have it justified, that you can propose these. What would be the way to put it is that that if you wanted to know the facts of the world, is that through consensus, with enough people that you can, what is the term, asymptotically or
asymptotically?
Yes, yeah. You can through that, in people's opinions, you can, you might not be able to reach like certainty on something, but you will converge close to certainty on that.
Yeah, I agree on that.
But I don't think that he's ever trying to say that that you have to strictly rely on these assumptions, and I think that's just the point that I disagreed with.
I'm not sure if I was trying to say that that's what he was implying. More or less the point of that he wasn't appearing to attempt to make any decisions without at some point referring to someone else. That he wasn't trying to do it unilaterally.
Yeah, and I also thought the point was, it could have just been you at a different position or you at a different time. The appeal was that the sense data is, I guess, contextual, right? And is there anything in that context which is consistent between all observers or all minds? And I think that's what he's pointing to. He's found some things which are necessarily on the assumption that reality is only one thing that we're all observing, or all sense data is observing, then necessarily these things must be preserved. So I think then we look at the real world and find that they are preserved, and that would give us some confidence to accept that the assumption is true. and that's what I'm getting from it, which I think is quite, you know, well within Einstein. I mean, it seems to be mathematics, so I'm not sure whether that is then the way Russell is really going with it. But again, I don't know the next chapter either, right? So I'm just up to chapter 3 now. In chapter 1, he made some assumptions. In chapter 2, he made some more assumptions.
Yes, indeed.
And then based upon those, he's saying, look, here are some common features. And
well, but this is really interesting, Simon. Thank you, because if really we can be more sure about these two little relations, well, going into chapter 4, which is called idealism, maybe he's going to use those to say that that's you know, another reason why real Barclay type idealism just can't be right.
yeah,
So it's nice to have understood this better.
I don't think saying it can't be right, because again, it would appear even under the argument that if you know, it's I'm still making assumptions as to the nature of reality when I'm assuming that these properties are conserved, right? So
right,
that seems to me still a flaw, which can't really be addressed directly. But again, it's the best explanation as I understand it. I mean, it's what we would expect, you know, under the hypothesis that there is only one reality that we're all observing.
Well, I can't wait to hear what he has to say about idealism. Twice he has said, in my opinion, fallacious, without explaining. So I guess we're saving up for the next chapter.
Right.
Does anyone want to say anything else about this? Because I'd like to talk to Saka about his coherence.
If I could say one thing before Joe or Jack get it, which is, you know, my understanding is generally naive of these things, right? So, you know, this was the nugget which I took out of this chapter specifically, or towards the end of it. So is he saying anything other than what I'm supposing he's saying? That, I guess. Joe,
John, Jack, anybody?
Soccer. Anybody that's read it?
Well, no, I think you're getting the gist.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, and I think I agree with Carrie that that Bertrand doesn't seem to be too interested in justifying it without some sort of corroborating evidence, right? Like, he seems like, it's true that he's making a lot of assumptions, but it seems to me that, like, he lays out his justifications for making those assumptions quite well. Especially when regarding the assumption of an external world seems to be, you know, almost part and parcel with the acceptance of sense data. And I think that that's, you know, he does make some great points about that. But go ahead, Joe, please.
When you say corroborate, I can't say that word. When you say see evidence, see word evidence, what do you mean? What would be corroborating evidence?
Well, the idea of the sense data of the self and then the not self. And so you then start adding labels to that. You start adding labels. Well, what is the stuff that I label as me, and what is the stuff that doesn't seem to be part of me? And then you keep doing that, and you eventually are building this framework of what constitutes your perception of reality. And
I'm not sure if I'm asking what's meant by how would you show evidence of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, right? I don't think you have to show evidence, right? Like, that's very.
I don't think so either, but I wasn't sure if there was some idea that you were trying to convey. So.
Well, I mean, like, I think in certain senses he is trying to say that it's meant to be what is publicly available. So in some senses there could be a possible demonstration of it, but I don't think he considers it in that sense.
I'm not sure. What I probably should say, like, I don't want to feel like I'm ambushing. I'm just thinking, I don't think this is the way to approach it, to think of it as, look, there's evidence. The idea is to make sure this view is consistent with other frameworks you have. Make sure, kind of some of the stuff Carrie, I don't think I've ever met him before, Carrie mentioned earlier, right? Like, but you know, I don't want to speak about much else because I haven't read the book. It sounded, the only other thing I would appeal to that it sounded like it was mentioned earlier is look, if it's a case that I believe, what is it, our senses aren't trustworthy, then how would we be able to make predictions of stuff? And it seems like we want to be able to make predictions, but to make predictions, we kind of have to assume that our senses are trustworthy and that these senses conveyed a a past, present, and eventually they'll convey a future that will allow us to make sense of these predictions.
And I think that was a large part of what he did in the very beginning by trying to differentiate the idea of talking about the absolute concept and the content of that concept that you are capable of acquiring. And so it's a very provisional thing in the way he's describing it. He's totally acknowledging that you're not talking about the absolute of the nature of what you're talking about. You're only talking about what you're holding in your hands, almost, not everything else around it. And the reason that you should try to rely on that is because it is something you've perceived, but it's also something you can then compare to what other people are perceiving. Even if you've never confirmed that these are actual people you're talking to, just there are other sets of sense data that you seem to be able to use to compare them. And through that comparison, you're gaining something. You're acquiring a reliability, a purity from the refining process of that comparison.
I think he's saying that. I mean, the thing that he uses, he didn't explain it the way that Simon did. He really just said, there are these two special cases, and well, my other senses always agree. If it's let's say we're talking about vision, my other senses always agree, so I can use my other senses. The sense data I get from my other senses, I should say, and other people, and the map, I think, is a creation of other people. So he is. I agree with you, Carrie. I do think he is saying that.
I thought that was very well put, actually. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, one thing I did find interesting about this chapter was that he doesn't really answer the question that he starts out with at the beginning of the chapter, right?
Oh my God, that so outraged me.
It really pissed me off too. Because he waits till the second last paragraph to spill the beans that he doesn't really think there is a nature that you can, doesn't he? What he says, it's quite gratuitous to suppose that physical objects have properties of this sort. Like, that's a very, I don't know, it's such a letdown when it seems like he really does set out to answer that question at the beginning.
Well, he's been promising it from chapter 1 on, that he was going to tell us about the nature of matter.
Well, may have he been mentioning or referring to it when he was talking about the lightning? Right. So
no, what does he say? He's talking about color when he says it.
Right. So in the same, and I think he might be. Again, I'm naive, right? So this is probably way under what he's actually saying. But the kind of what I was getting from it, in some sense, was that he was saying that lightning happens simultaneously. The sound and the light comes out simultaneously at the place where the lightning happens, because it's caused by the air, etc., etc. Although we don't receive that data for some time because of the time it takes for the air to be disturbed before we hear it. And I think that was a nod, or at least an implication, that, we're still going to find, even under color, we're still going to find a conserved property, right? Which, of course, we know actually is frequency, right? So under any transformations, the order in which the frequencies happen are all obviously going to be transformed equally. So they're always going to happen in the same order, exactly the same as time. Mm-hmm. So I think even with color, you still have that same situation, although it's much harder to detect because what you're relying on is much finer distinction.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, that he's falling back on that we can still perceive the relation, but not necessarily the thing itself. That makes a lot of sense. But I think he does sort of refuse to answer the question of the chapter for sure.
Right. So by nature, what does he mean, or what do you mean by nature?
Yeah, I mean that sort of direct relation, right? I can't really perceive, right? I think he raises a good point about that. We're not really directly seeing light, right? Like we see the result of a wave hitting our eyes, right? Which is a different sort of perception than simply light that we're seeing.
Yes.
And I don't know. Yeah, like I think that's from there it does naturally lead to the discussion of idealism, which I think is exciting that it's the next chapter.
Good. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
I am too. Does anybody else want to say anything about what we said so far before I interrogate Sokka a little bit?
Sorry, say what now?
I just want to find out if anybody else wants to add anything so far.
No, I meant about the interrogate Sokka part.
Yeah, that's coming later.
All right, cool.
Okay, I guess if that's a no, then Sokka, let me ask: did you read or listen to chapters 1 and 2 at all? Specifically, chapter 2.
Not yet.
So he talks in there about instinctive beliefs, and we talked about that last week. And I think what he says sort of is all we really have are these instinctive beliefs, and philosophy can do this job of helping us know which beliefs of ours are really instinctive beliefs and which ones we've mistaken for instinctive beliefs. And philosophy can help us organize our beliefs, even our instinctive beliefs, in a hierarchy, and help us decide which ones to throw out and which ones to keep. And the criterion he uses for this idea of helping us decide which ones to throw out and which ones to keep is this idea whether or not they cohere with our other instinctive beliefs. So it's sort of like he's doing...
I should have been here for that.
It's like he's doing two things. It sounds like he's kind of being a foundationalist, and then at the end, it sounds like he's kind of being a coherentist, in that he's saying that the thing we should use to determine whether or not to throw out an instinctive belief is whether it coheres with our other instinctive beliefs.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so the first question I have is, I want to hear what you think about this idea of instinctive beliefs. I feel like it would be kind of safe to say that, you could call those intuitions. And if that's true, is he preferring intuitions over arguments? He even says, in chapter 2, he says, well, we naturally, all of us share these instinctive beliefs that there is an external world and that it really exists. And it's only by argument that we've come to doubt it. So let's go with the instinctive beliefs. And that seems like almost like he's saying we should prefer our instinctive beliefs even in the face of arguments, unless those arguments, I don't even think there's an unless there. There might be unless those arguments completely defeat the instinctive beliefs, so that the arguments have convinced us that we are just completely wrong about those instinctive beliefs. But it really looked to me like he was advocating preferring instinctive beliefs over argument. So I want to know what you think about intuition, and how does that fit in with your coherentism? Okay,
so all right, so I'm gonna try to get this out. I'm actually out and about with my kid right now, so if I kind of jumble over this a little bit, I'm trying to do my best here. Okay, so the idea is that the relationship between reality, or what we perceive in reality in the mind, is this causal relation. It's not it's not a justificational relationship. We're not trying to necessarily justify these things. But so how do I put this here? Within a coherent system, there has to be the laws attributing to a high degree of reliability to a variety of these what we call cognitively spontaneous beliefs. Okay, so in order for a coherent sense of justification to work, your system of beliefs of has to be such that the laws attributing to this high degree of reliability that produce these cognitively spontaneous beliefs are shoot. Let me try a different way to do this. Okay. So we have so a cognitively spontaneous belief is a belief that comes on without exactly as it says. It forms like out of nothing. Okay. Yeah, we take it as a perception of some type of external world, but it comes out of the ether. It just kind of cognitively spontaneously arrives. That's it. Now we can take these beliefs on and and believe that they're true, that they're in reference to a true kind of external reality, or we can reject them. And the way that we do that, we would either accept or reject them is based on how well they cohere with the beliefs that we have. So, and that's how we would justify these beliefs. Now, we're not justifying them based off of the experience, because that would be foundationalism. You justify them off of how well the belief fits with other beliefs. So, if I was to so what basically is you're not inferring that there is a reality outside of your mind. And these beliefs that result from any sort of they don't result from any sort of like deliberate process. They just kind of occur. They just happen. They strike you in a manner that's completely involuntary. Like you have no choice but to take these beliefs on, and they're also very coercive. So
I wonder if that might be a good way to think about what people mean when they say, "Oh, it's just self-evident."
Well, it wouldn't be self-evident yet. So what happens after you have these beliefs is that they're processed against the other beliefs that you have. If the beliefs cohere, they're justified. If they don't cohere, they're not justified. So you're not trying to justify these experiences by relying on your senses or anything like that. You're not trying to use your sense experience to validate or justify what you're taking on is what these cognitively spontaneous beliefs are. The justification comes by how well it coheres with the beliefs, and so in that sense, you can have what we call like this. We can call it sensory data. We can call it the cognitively spontaneous belief. You can call it whatever. If you wanted to justify it, like from a foundationalist viewpoint, you would have to start off with the assumption that your senses were reliable, but you're not trying to justify it through this assumption that your senses are reliable. You justify it purely based on how well it coheres. Like that's just the nature of coherentism, is that the justification always comes down to how well does it cohere. And so for when you are processing these spontaneous beliefs or these intuitive beliefs, you're never going to try to justify them from your senses. You accept that they just appear, and then you just accept or reject them based on how well they fit with your beliefs. So if I was to wave my hand in front of my face, and I see it, it's there, but I'm not actually seeing my hand. What's happening is I'm forming a belief about seeing my hand, and I'm not validating it using my senses. It's validated because I believe that at this time I am waving my hand there, and that that it's cohering with other beliefs I have about the situation of me waving my hand there, and therefore it's justified that I'm waving that I know that I'm waving my hand in front of my face.
It's interesting. If I can go back to something that you said at the very beginning of this little spiel here, it seems like Russell does say that that these beliefs in an external world, let's just use that as an example, or let's go back. Let's talk about a physical object. That we have this experience of the physical object, but let's take vision. I have to even break it down even more. You look at a table, and you get these sense data, which are internal and objects, and that's what you're actually seeing when you look at the table. And that what happens when you form the belief if you will, as you're saying, it's being formed, that it is a table and that there's a real table out there and that there's an external world by extension, is that is an inference that you do. And you, in your description, you are, it sounds like you're saying, no, there's not inferring happening. This is just an immediate belief that forms. So would you think that it's that if you accept his notion of sense data, would you agree or disagree that when we decide it's a table, or when we come to see it as a table, as opposed to just bits of data coming in, right? Like, you know, a weird shape coming in and color patches, that when we see it in a gestalt as a table, would you agree or disagree that there's any inferencing going on?
There's no inference. No, I would disagree. There's an inference going on. You're not deducing that there's a table there. You're not you like I said, it's not a you're not actually, I think I said it, is that you're not inferring anything about there being a table. What you are is you're having this spontaneous belief form that says there's a table out there, and then you have your net of beliefs that will either cohere with the fact that there's a table there or not.
And then you apply a label to what you're perceiving as table without ever claiming to absolutely know that that's a table.
I don't think I understand.
Well, I mean, I don't understand absolutely no. I mean, like that's always kind of a weird term. Nothing. Even if my beliefs, are coherent, even if I think that I can justify my beliefs through coherency, I would never claim to have that it's absolute. I think that's just not a requirement for me to justify anything that I believe.
No, I agree, and I think it's a very useful thing to have, is to be able to talk about something with staying away from the concept of absolutes, and still have a reasonable conversation, because I think that shuts down conversations.
Yeah. Brenda, you wanted to say something about inferencing.
I just don't understand anything that's being said.
Do you understand my attempt to to say what it was that I thought Russell was saying?
A little bit.
I think it's weird to talk about Russell like proposing foundationalism or coherentism in that chapter, right? Like I think he's clearly giving an outline of the whole of each system, and I think that he does end up coming down on something that might be closer to like a founderantism of some sort, right? Where he's using coherent methods in order to justify belief systems, but is still realizing that there's still some reliance on your senses in order to come to those realizations. Sokka, I was curious about the way you described it, right? Because the way you were describing experiences of, like, let's say your hand waving in front of your face, I get that your description of it is devoid of sense data, but that experience doesn't seem to me to be devoid of sense data for you to come up with a justification, to describe what it is, to describe what's happening. And I'm curious how he would how it would be coherent with the rest of your beliefs if those beliefs weren't also about sense data that was incoming, about your hand and where it was and spatial information and all those things.
Well, so in that sense, like I said, that these beliefs that spontaneously form, they're not based on any type of inference or anything like that. They simply form. And so for the example for like the hand, or I did an example with Chris Maldy earlier, talking about the beer bottle on the table in front of me, or something like that. Is that I think what it comes down to is that there is this what you'd call sense data that's coming in. When what I was saying is that to say that it's sense data is I think first off to start with the assumption that you're sensing something, like that there's an external world to sense there, and right. I don't want to start off with this supposition that there's an external world where I'm gathering this from. All I know at this point in time is that a belief has formed. Okay, so a belief has formed about something that I'm perceiving to be an external reality, And
I think you're jumping so many steps there, right? Like, I mean, the sense data comes in, and it's not like you just believe there's a hand. Like the second that a sense data of a hand comes in, right? Like that doesn't seem like a really coherent way of describing it.
Like it's just like a non-referential.
To me, like it's like direct realism without the need for an object. It's very strange to me.
But well, I mean, it sounds like I guess you put it in terms of skipping steps, but I feel like it's just a huge leap over a gaping gap of confusion to say these beliefs just pop up. It seems like you could just appeal to any belief and say, well, it just kind of popped up. If it's a case that you think you can't justify these beliefs because they just popped up, that's fine. But what are we to?
I don't think Sokka's quite saying that, actually.
What if we redefine this slightly for you so that you'd see it a different way?
What?
You have data coming in, and you are just giving it a label of some sort, and that's what he's talking about. It's not truly arbitrary because it's based off of stuff you are perceiving, but you're assigning it some type of label so that you can then process it. And the assigning it of a label may not be more complicated than initially, this is something that is not me.
Did you mentioned a reason why we're assigning it a label? It's why exactly?
That would be one of those things that just occurs, that you just assign labels to things. It's part of a facet of your consciousness that you label things.
This is just a description of how we take in things that we see. Then it's
more or less how you organize it, not necessarily take it in, because that you would hope is the boundary of what you define as a sense data, is how you take in the information, and then at some point you're processing it and giving it some sort of label as an instinctive action.
Yeah, I mean,
Russell's describing the process of organizing it. You're not saying that this is a way. You're not telling us that this way of organizing such, I guess, sense data is. You're not pointing to a specific way to organize it. You're just saying this is how it is naturally, right?
Well, you will at some point just be assigning certain base labels to things, just so you could have a frame of reference. Even if it's the only thing, like you're keeping it really simple in the very beginning, that there are certain labels that are just assigned. And then there are ones that you actively assign based off of a continuous, coherent expansion of me versus not me, to eventually this is a reality that that is part of me. And you just keep expanding it as an ever expanding bubble of labels that you label on things.
Well, I think we can still have this discussion without needing the labels to be linguistic labels. Would you agree? I mean, you're using the term label, but I think, would it be safe to say that you could also think of it as like seeing a table as a table, but not as a quote unquote table? In other words, you see a whole.
Yes.
Okay, good.
That's part of what he said in the very beginning of the chapter, is that you can accept that you're only sensing a portion of what it might actually be in its totality, and you would still therefore be justified in labeling that for the sake of being able to sort it and use it.
So Russell, to me, is trying to paint the picture in chapter 1 sort of like this, that what actually comes in is just splotches of color and lines, and maybe you can kind of think of it like primary properties, and then it goes through your mind, and your mind turns it into a table, and that turning it into a table is an inference. But I think Sokka's saying, no, when you look at something, you don't have this in your visual field, these just bizarre squiggle marks and raw sense data. You actually see a table.
Yeah, I don't think that can be. I don't think that can be right.
Well, I think it may be trying to understand the idea of identity in the first place, because the whole idea of identifying something is to give it a label, a name, and incorporated in that is the description of that label. And that constitutes identity of anything.
Well, but you can imagine this whole thing that we've been talking about with something that you don't know the name of, right? And it would still happen. I mean, you would still see that
you'd
thing
still take the information, and at some point you'd be able to you form two different things about it. You give it some kind of label, and there's some kind of description, and that description would be based off of some of the sense data that came in. But your consciousness is the part that applies the label.
Mm. So, Brenda, you were saying that you disagree. What is it that you disagree with, and
why? That we just have this immediate experience of the table. If I'm understanding correctly, we just perceive it.
What else? That's I mean that's the question, is that you like, do you have access, like, do you have access to the physical world? I mean, you don't.
Yeah,
like,
of course I do.
For me?
Yeah, of course I have access to the physical world.
Well, fundamentally, you would only know that you have access to something that is not you. And so at that point, it becomes a sort of an accepted.
I don't understand. Yes. I don't understand that.
No,
I'm in the physical world. I'm not separate from it. Your reply has an assumption within it that I am not part of the physical world, which I would.
Oh no, not at all. Not at all.
Just that there's a delineation in your mind that you can make between you and everything else.
What I was saying was that you don't have direct access to the physical world. Like the belief that you form about what you think is the physical world is nothing more than just something that just forms in your mind. Like now the reason why we can think that this is justified for whatever reason is because we can view this as some type of causal relationship to what might actually be a physical world, but you don't try to justify it. I think that the point that I was trying to put out there was not necessarily that it would have been that you're not trying to justify something with your senses. You're not, because you have these beliefs that form, and you don't even have to. You can form certain beliefs about the reliability of your senses, and then you could have these beliefs form spontaneously in your mind about what you're perceiving in the external world, and you can justify those things as well. And you can justify those things without actually having to, first off, assume that your senses were reliable. That's what I was kind of getting at.
Okay, I'm not sure I get it, but okay.
I think he's maybe saying, please correct me now, Soccer, that if my beliefs are not in contradiction with each other, then that's a good reason to think that they are true.
Well, yeah, that just comes down to the standard justification for any coherentist viewpoint would be, if you take on these beliefs that form, you're not making inferences about what they are. You're saying that that these beliefs have formed about the external world, and how well they cohere with your other beliefs provides a justification for whether you can say that you know what these experiences are in reference to the external world.
I think Russell's saying a little more than that.
Yeah, I think that Russell's saying a little more as well. I think that and I understand that John's point is that there is kind of a, I understand there is kind of like a missing step in here, and I really want to bridge that, except it's it's tough to do right now.
Yeah, no worries. Brenda?
Well, in the case of a hallucination, don't I also have just beliefs that just appear, and don't those beliefs also simply cohere together while I'm having the hallucination? So if I have a hallucination of a knife, I have these spontaneous beliefs that it's shiny, the handle is wood, that it's sharp and it's pointed, it has a certain heft, and all these beliefs cohere. Nevertheless, it's a hallucination.
Yeah.
So am I justifying?
Therefore, it doesn't matter.
So am I justified in concluding that my hallucinated knife is real?
You're justified in deciding that it's pointless and doesn't matter. Because even if it is a hallucination, all the rules of your existence in reality are included in the hallucination, and you have no choice but to deal with it anyway. So one way or the other, it's irrelevant. You just deal with things as you have to deal with them.
Right. And I think
deal
that's
with it by
I don't
saying
think
that it
that's
doesn't matter.
The other point, Brenda, would be that, like, let's say
Yeah,
that you did
I
have.
don't agree with that.
No,
I
it
didn't
wouldn't
really
matter at
understand
all.
the response. So
It's that thing from Wittgenstein and Wittgenstein. I never say his name right.
Wittgenstein.
Yeah, the idea about the dream, the idea that if someone was to try to question if they were awake or dreaming, it wouldn't matter, because even the question is part of the dream, and any relevance that it has is part of the dream. So you have to accept it one way or the other, that it is what it is, and go ahead.
I'm not really hold on. I'm not really sure if that's exactly what's being said or what I understand. I understand it that if we're in like a dream state, right, then things that we would say are prescriptions, they actually don't matter within that dream state. They don't hold the same sway that they would in reality. So we're not beholden to any type of like framework that requires us to justify stuff when we're in this dream state.
But then you'd have to be able to justify the difference between the dream and being awake.
Okay. I guess that's the end of what I was saying.
No, go ahead, Joe. I mean, I like this point.
Yeah, but I mean, I was like two words away. So, but we are supposed to do this justification game in, I guess, in the real world, if you will, compared to the dream world. I'm not sure.
You technically need to do it in both worlds, because there's no reason not to do it in both worlds.
Why ought we do it in the dream world?
Because you couldn't tell the difference. You wouldn't know if you were dreaming or awake. That only becomes a relevant question if you can actually determine that you're awake or dreaming. And then you can differentiate how you need to behave in both of these worlds. But you can't. You don't know that. So the only choice left to you is to behave the same way regardless.
No, I mean,
are we talking
saying
under coherentism or foundationalism, right? Like, I think under coherentism, that is the objection, right? That you have no reason to act differently in the dream than you have in reality. The coherentist side, right? I mean, you could just move it to a matrix example, right? Where now the world is a perfect representation of the real world, except, none of the prescriptions apply, like Joe was saying. Like, so, I mean, we could say that it has less value, but we would be forced through coherentism to assert that is the real world for all intents and purposes, like, just because it really does cohere so well.
And following it through, can you truly come up with a list of things that would be different in both of those situations? You'd still have to deal with the reality as you perceive it. You don't really have another choice.
What was this?
I kind of want to hear what Joe. Oh, sorry. Let me just say, I kind of want to hear what. I kind of want to hear more about what Joe was saying.
I was just trying to understand. I was just trying to understand. Like, are you saying we're not able to discern whether or not we're in the matrix or real world, or maybe it's just that Russell's saying that, or are you guys also saying that, or do you guys disagree?
No, I mean,
with Russell?
Russell is making like a very foundationalist argument, right? I mean, he's talking about our senses are rooted in at.
Oh, I think we just lost John.
I kicked him. I was sick of him.
I would say it comes down to his definition of sense data, Russell's definition of sense data. So, I mean, that was where the argument seemed to me, and it was that if we only have our sense data that is within our mind, and if we're dreaming, then we're dreaming. Right? If we don't know we're dreaming, then that's still our sense data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but if we do know we're dreaming, fair enough, that's a different case. But if we don't know we're dreaming, then the sense data is just sense data as it is through real senses.
Yep.
And I say real senses in inverted commas.
Okay, so I was understanding that we were also going further and talking about how we ought to do things when Big Dub was mentioned, right? When he was talking about how we would go about being rational in a sleep state versus actually being rational in the real world. But Russell, he doesn't go that far. That's not something that's spoken about until see, it's a terrible last name, this guy. Wittgenstein started, I guess, talking about kind of a different thing. All Russell is saying is we have the sense data, whether or not we're in a dream state or the real world, we're just going to have to appeal. We're appealing to the same thing no matter what, right? We're in the dream state. We're still using the same, like, I guess, apparatus, and without the yeah, okay.
Yeah, the specific quote I put over in the comments, it says, "The argument I may be dreaming is senseless for this reason. If I am dreaming, this remark is being dreamed as well. And indeed, it is also being dreamed that these words have any meaning. So even if you are dreaming, it doesn't matter, because that is still your entire frame of reference for how you're supposed to deal with the sense data. You don't have any other frame of reference than the reality as is."
Are you guys familiar with Alex Malpass? He wrote a blog post about this argument, or about this argument, right?
Yeah.
It's really, I found it really neat, and the idea is, look, when we dream, and I don't know, I go and steal all your guys' wallets and car keys and drive away with your cars. If that were in the real world, someone could have some moral system that would say I ought not do that, or would punish me for doing that. But I wake up from the dream. It seems silly for me to have any guilt for doing that to you guys, or it seems even more silly for you guys to call the police to come and get me. It was in a dream, right? So it seems like these, this appeal to normative system, or just evaluative system, or other just appeals to being rational in our dreams, don't really work when you're in the dream state, whereas they do make sense when we're in reality. And so that's kind of the way I started seeing what Wittgenstein was saying. And so it does seem like it would be important to differentiate being in a dream state versus actually being in reality. Because if you're in the dream state, then it does seem like you're not really beholden to these normative systems. Because remember, I woke up, I didn't have to worry about going to jail from my actions that I performed in my dream, right?
Of course. Yeah.
And again, it seems you're beholden based off the comparison between awake and dreaming, though.
Yeah, you have to know that you're in the dream state in order for that to hold true. That's and of course, if you don't know, that's the situation that we're interested in.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like,
we do know.
I don't know if I missed it, or if it's the very next topic or whatever, but is it the case that Russell talks about a way where we can discern?
No.
No?
Didn't he at the beginning of the chapter seem to hint that you might be able to do that, and then doesn't go on to explain that? Is that what he missed?
Well, he may be building up. I haven't read the whole thing.
Total tease.
What he did say is that, there are these two sense data examples. We can say that the sense data always corresponds with the presumed external reality. So maybe, if the order, in time or something changes in your dream, you can know you're dreaming. Some weird thing like that, perhaps.
Well, no, I mean, like, I think Russell does, in fact, like, go on to extend the space example to all other senses, right? Like,
yes,
because he goes to say that, like, okay, we have this idea of space, right? But that senses, which are where our sense data is always residing in our private space, and like that space is either hearing space or light space or sound space, right? And that we're putting it in that space when we receive that sense data. And so I think in that sense, like, he's saying that we have the same level of relationship that we can apply to space as in our conceptions of all the other sense data. So I think he's making maybe a further statement about the reliability of our senses if we can be sure about the relationships that we observe through those senses. But you're right that it doesn't tell us about the real world or what is intrinsic about nature. And I think that that's where he does miss the
Yeah,
boat on
he
that,
stays away from absolutes. So very deliberately, he seems to stay away from absolutes.
Right.
So I think he has a general rule for the senses, but I definitely think that he shirks away from the idea that we can get any information about the specifics of the properties of nature.
Yes.
Or the properties of matter itself.
Right. I think I agree with that.
It occurred to me on what Joe said that, of course, the way we understand that we're not dreaming when we're dreaming is because things that happen can't happen in the non-dreaming state. So,
what do you mean? I'm
Like,
not
well,
listening.
you said, well, when we awake, well, sometimes we actually realize we're dreaming when we're actually dreaming, right? And things take a weird turn because they're weird because they're not reflecting
lucid dreaming,
the state.
right?
Well, whatever kind of dream. When we understand we're dreaming, right, it's because we've noticed something in the dream which doesn't correspond to reality as we understand it when we're not dreaming.
So imagine a dream in which everything corresponds exactly the same, and you would never be aware you were dreaming unless you woke up.
Indeed. In which case, it may as well be reality.
I think we're just all going to have to watch Inception backwards. In that way.
Oh, I was just going to ask Han Solo if he wanted to.
I was sick of him. He's out.
Oh, you kicked him too?
Yeah, I kicked him.
Well, you just kicked me.
Joe, you're such a snipe.
Sorry, I'm sorry, Helena. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think this is a good time to end. We've been going at it about the amount of time that I wanted to.
Before you do,
yes,
Jack, did you just want to say something? Because I think I saw you on mute.
I don't think he's
I want
here.
to say one thing too.
No, I didn't see you on mute. That's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Soccer.
Jack agrees with everything I said, so it's not a big deal.
No, he did unmute. I was right. I'm not delusional. Reality is really there.
Soccer, you want to say something?
Actually, it's going to rehash an old point, but no, never mind. We'll talk about this later. I wish that I was able to get it out a little bit clearer today, but unfortunately, you caught me when I was out grocery shopping and other stuff, and we'll have to make if we want to talk about this later, we can maybe have a further discussion on this.
Sure, we can do it probably next week if you come in. I still really want to have this hangout that sort of talks about the arguments against the notion of sense data and for direct realism, but we'll do that some other time as well. I guess want to say thanks to everybody, and we'll see you all next week.
Okie dokie.